human action, that suppose there is an act which is connected with salvation, a human act and a man being saved. Well, according to the fundamentalist view, if there is such an act and it is necessary for salvation, then that same act cannot be sufficient for salvation. That is, if it's something we must do, then it is something that is not in itself enough for salvation. I'll explain why in a moment. And conversely, if there is an act which, if you do it, it is enough to be saved, it is sufficient, then that same act is not necessary. That is, if it is enough, then it isn't required. It will do the job, but so will something else. You don't need to do that thing. The reason being that if there is a human act which is both necessary and sufficient for salvation, then you have a human act which is equivalent to salvation. And that goes against at least one branch of Christianity and a basic tenet, that there is nothing a man does that is equivalent to his salvation. But that's what you get when you have these two directions of the arrow of implication. It's necessary and sufficient. It means if and only if. A man is saved if and only if this means A is equivalent to B. It's a difficult position, but it's a position that some have created for themselves. Salvation, as it happens, is not precisely the concern of the Muslim in the first place. That is, the Quran doesn't say anything about it. Salvation. It talks about men being lost, but it draws as a contrast not that they are lost or they are saved. The contrast is that a man may well be lost, or it may be that he has gained something. He is successful to some extent, to varying degrees. He loses out completely, or he gains something, and maybe more than somebody else. You lose or you are successful. It's not a question of black and white. It's either none or some, not all or none. And so the Muslim's real concern is concerning his actions. He wants to appreciate his limitations and his duties. That's basically all. And it's interesting enough that it is the nature of proof that if something is impossible, it is theoretically, or in principle at least, subject to being proved. You can't always prove when something's possible. But if something is impossible, that is always open to proof. And it is always open to proof if something is necessary. You can't always prove something is unnecessary, but you can always demonstrate that something is necessary. And so it is that it can always be established what it is a man cannot do and what it is he must do, his limitations and his duties. And that's what the Muslim is trying to find out about. Not so much about how to get saved, but he's trying to find out which things are a waste of time because they cannot be done, and which are the things that I cannot overlook, I must do. Now to go back, kind of in summary, I suppose there are sort of two thoughts that came up here. Spent a lot of time, and maybe more than I should have, on the treatment of Scripture and how it is viewed. And for the most part, that's for the benefit of the Muslim. To try to get across to the Muslim that not everybody who calls himself Christian has the same ideas about what the Bible does, what it's supposed to do. There are varying views on that. It is one stream of Christianity that says the Bible is inerrant. These are the words God spoke. Even in the places where he said he didn't. Yes, because there are places like that. Paul said in one place, at least, he said, what you're about to read didn't come from God. There are those who say these are God's words precisely. The mainstream of Christianity doesn't go along with that. When the apparent errors are cited, the usual retreat is to say, these are errors of transmission. That is, these mistakes were not there in the original manuscripts. Which might be true, but we'll never know, will we? Since nobody has an original manuscript. It makes it a pretty empty claim to say, I have a perfect book, I just can't get my hands on a perfect copy. Well, what good is this book if you don't know what used to be in it? But it has not, after all, been so well preserved historically. But at this point, the two streams of Christianity tend to meet, because they will both say, yes, but all these apparent errors do not touch on major doctrine in the first place. Personally, I disagree with that, but they tend to agree on this point, both the mainstream and the other branch of Christianity, to say, well, even if there are mistakes of transmission, they don't touch on major doctrinal issues. At this point, though, the mainstream of Christianity will try to tell this other branch, then the reason for that is that the Bible itself doesn't talk very much about major doctrines. That's the reason why these verses that may have been miscopied don't touch on major doctrine, because most of the Bible doesn't in the first place. That's what Martin Luther said about the Bible. He said most of it's irrelevant, because his basic philosophy was, unless a verse talks about a certain subject, his particular pet subject, he said, then it's doubtful that it is Scripture. And in his edition of the Bible, he took the books of James, Hebrews, and Revelation and put them in the back like an appendix, because he said they don't belong up here with the rest of the Scripture. 100 years later, they were moved back. But the point is that the attitude that all of it is of equal value is an old and even fundamentalist position won't go along with it, to say that not all of it speaks in the same way. It doesn't very often really touch on major doctrine. And so the next step in this explanation is to say, but we know that the doctrine has been transmitted historically correct, because that's what the Bible is about. It's a record of a continuity of the Christian community. And that's largely true, but remember the original objection was this document of historical continuity has suffered some problems in the continuity. It hasn't been that well translated. Regarding thought, I was trying to encourage the idea of thinking about these things. There's just one final suggestion that I'd make there, is to beware of a lot of things that pass for proof. Very often, what people consider proof of something is a proof of something which is unreasonable by nature. That is, a person will tell you about a certain doctrine, and when you say that makes no sense, they will tell you, yes, it is beyond reason. And look, I have proof that it's true. Well, that's self-contradictory. You see, if you produce a proof of something that is unreasonable, then something's wrong with your proof. See, the scientist who does the thought experiment in his mind, and he thinks, if A is true, then B is true, and that would mean C, and therefore D, and that's crazy. Wow, let me call the newspapers. I've proved a crazy thing. See, he doesn't do that. When he arrives at something that makes no sense, he goes back and thinks, well, I must have started with a wrong assumption, or there's something faulty in my argument. We don't rejoice at an unreasonable conclusion that arrives at by a process of reasoning. Something's wrong with the proof is the usual signal. So those are some thoughts, and I would actually be more interested in what you're thinking than what I'm thinking. If you have some questions or comments, don't be shy to speak up. Thank you for your time and attention in any case. I'll do that.
Can we ask you questions, not exactly on the gospel, but
sure.
on, in relation to some words that we hear, Sunnis and Shiites, what like we understand Protestants and Catholics, so...
Yes, it's not quite parallel to that historically. Those are really nicknames that were bestowed on people. I don't think people, at least years ago, people did not deliberately tell you, I'm Sunni or Shia or Wahhabi or something like that. Those are nicknames bestowed from outside, just as I don't think the first Protestant said, I'm a Protestant. That is a label that came on.